Hey everybody. Before starting today's episode, I just wanted to, kind of make an announcement. I'm not sure how I would say that. So, when I first started Psychotropic, which was only a few months ago, I thought it would be interesting to present stories as told by the people who lived those stories, with those stories involving psychotropic substances, or having psychotropic substances laced throughout those stories in some way. And while some stories have more substance use than others, they all have that common feature. And I wanted to find people who had stories, which turns out to be everybody, that meant something that other people could relate with and maybe draw some sort of wisdom from. And I wanted the listener to be able to figure all this out on their own, to be able to listen to these stories and come up with their own meaning for these stories. And I basically largely left it up to the listener to do that. And what I found is I want to chime in. I want to be able to talk about these stories a little bit. I mean, I find them really interesting and I listen to them a lot, especially when I'm going through and editing and trying to make this presentable. So, I think that I'm going to try to chime in a little bit in the beginning, at least in this one, and hopefully in future ones, just to kind of give an overview of my take and what I find interesting. So, I guess, to go on with this one, I like how this story is both uplifting as well as a cautionary tale. And it uses the same substance for both instances. It's really interesting how this substance both caused or contributed to the grief of the subject, as well as helped him ultimately break through, in my opinion. It allowed him to... He was able to look back and actually see that he was just interpreting the experience in a detrimental way. One thing about this episode that you might want to keep in mind is that the subject talks extensively about this term he calls Zen sickness. And this is something that we discussed in his previous episode, which you can find. It's under the name Vox. And I was interested in that, and I had asked him to elaborate on it a little bit. And so he actually spent about half of this episode explaining how he fell into what he's calling Zen sickness and how he was able to kind of get out of it. And then the second part is more about the specific experiences that contributed to both his Zen sickness and the coming out of, again, in my opinion. So, as you listen to this, I'm kind of curious to see if you actually draw the same conclusions as I did. Because, again, this was a really interesting one for me, and I hope it is for you too. And if you feel so inclined, drop me a line. I'd love to hear what you think. You can email me at psychotropicpodcast@hotmail.com. So, without going any further into it, let's get started. I hope you enjoy.
Hello?
Hey man, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Dude, you sound freaking clear, dude. I'd really like to hear about one of your DMT trips.
Right.
Give context for it, so like the before, what made you want to do this, maybe even like, you can basically whatever you want, and I'm just going to kind of ask questions from there, but...
So I guess I'll kind of just start from the beginning.
Psychotropic presents Vox Part 2.
Um, December 2014, that was the first time that I had my first DMT experience. And man, did that shake it changed everything. Like what happened essentially was Zen sickness to me, it's depression. I mean, if you want to try to put it, like define it as most of an observational and scientific sort of way, that's probably what was going on with me. But like having someone tell me that phrase gave me the context that I needed. Because also what we were just talking about with being like a ball of consciousness, like every person, every entity has a narrative, and because of language, we have these things that we tell ourselves, and it can be a detriment when we're doing problem solving, especially since that's what the brain is supposed to be doing all the time, and maybe we'll find more problems and things than are actually there. And that's definitely gotten me in trouble, like socially before, where I've gotten into just weird anxiety attacks and other such things that led me to think things were other than how they are. The narrative that I was developing with depression was just so strange, because I basically saw a new me take over, and I knew like it was slipping in there, and I didn't know how to get out. I didn't feel like I could trust anybody. I felt like there was like these weird life circumstances that happened that made me believe and informed me to think that I was truly alone in the sense of what depression is. And like we talked this, I think, in the last conversation we had about Carl Jung talking about like the feeling of being truly alone when someone feels that way when they're depressed, is that you feel like your thoughts and the things that compose your narrative are inadmissible to others, that you feel like you can't compare to other people and other stories and narratives. You feel like you're an island, essentially. And so, again, this also ties back into the sort of beautiful phrase of Zen sickness, because I actually equate this better to an analogy that was actually very present to where I was living when I was very depressed. I was living in Ashland, Oregon, when I heard the term. I was living on my brother's hillside, like a couple thousand feet up. And Zen sickness to me refers to like this idea in Buddhism that life is a mountain. And so there's this idea that depression is a plateau. And actually, I was thinking about this today. I was like, fuck, for me, it wasn't just a plateau. It was like a cesspool, a stagnant pit of despair on the plateau, just being beaten by the sun, being caked into this thing that no longer had any hydration. It had nothing left to thrive. There was no organic material that could exist in that realm of my mindscape. I felt like I had nothing left. So basically what happened in December 2014, I smoked DMT for the first time, and upon my arrival, coming back to this state of reality that we all share, I was so disenchanted. I knew something heavy was on the horizon, something that my depression didn't like prepare me for, or that any part of my life prepared me for. In the following months, the partner that I had had for about 4 years, she decided it was time for us to part ways. And while I knew that was a possibility, it still shook me more than I could have ever imagined, more than I wanted it, more than I thought it could, knowing that life is life, and I knew I would move on, and I would live, and I'd find other loves and friends and things that my life, like I would just become a new person. I knew that would eventually happen, but there's just something about this time, this breakup was the catalyst for so many other things. And then I subsequently then had more DMT experiences that just, it gave me I came back with the wrong lesson. I came back feeling more alienated because like I felt like I was in touch with the realm of reality that I always knew was out there. Being an artist, I just have always had this sense that there were other worlds around us, and this was basically the convincing factor of that. Like smoking DMT and having this molecule interact with my synapses, it made me believe that I had traveled inward through a portal out to the other side of the universe, very much in the kind of way that I was so obsessed with the movie Contact growing up. And that Jodie Foster, like, she basically had an inward journey. And I was so fascinated by that at a young age. And I've always been so fascinated by like science fiction and other worlds that I was just convinced this was it. This was how we were actually in touch with beings from the other side of the universe, and that they knew we were out here, and that everything that I had ever suspected was true in regards to feeling like there was something beyond what we know is what is life itself. So to me, that's when I was like, well, I'm so done. I'm so disenchanted with these human realms that were honestly at the time I just felt dragged down. I felt so beaten down from just like what had happened through the relationship, and feeling like all of my communication tools and cognitive tools were just stolen from me. I really did feel like when I was living in Ashland, Oregon, I would walk out at night and I would wonder who I was. And there were even a couple times where I think I had panic attacks and I had disassociative moments where I would actually look in the mirror and I didn't know what I was looking at. I was frightened. It was like an animal looking in a mirror for the first time. That's the only way I could describe it. Maybe it was like a temporary amnesia. Like, there's no way for me to prove any of this. And that's why I felt even more alone and even more depressed. I felt like there was no one I could relate to. And over the years, now that I've done all this research into psychotherapy and things like the Mindfulness Center that was established, that organization back like 40 years ago, and like the Assailant Center, people like Alex Shulgin, Timothy Leary, like that crazy dolphin dude, John C. Lilly, just like learning about all these different stories about consciousness helped give me this wider view of everything, of like getting some concept of what my life actually was. And that's what DMT was trying to teach me the entire time. And that's why I've died so many times. I died like numerous times. And in fact, there were these moments of being simultaneously attacked from entities and also being almost in their care too. It felt like I was in a battle between angels and demons. And I think that's like something that if anyone is like sort of questioning their state of reality, they're going to experience. I think it's good to be a skeptic, and I'm glad that I feel like I have this mental fort in these cognitive tools to recognize in those states that it's not real, even though it could feel as real as reality itself. I didn't need to hold on to that. Just like the same way that in this state of reality, we don't need to hold on to that narrative, that depressive narrative. And so what happened after the breakup, still like I think a year, wait, it was less than a year. Within a year, like over the course of 2015, I had these wonderful opportunities through music, but there was still just this part of me where I just felt like a shell. And so by the end of 2015, I had this opportunity to go live with my brother and his wife and their child in Ashland, Oregon. And that's where my sort of vision quest began. I mean, for lack of a better term, I was living with my brother's family for 4 months, basically trying to put myself back together. I should have been seeking out therapy. I should have been seeking out maybe even, I don't know, maybe some sort of prescription or something. But I just didn't trust anybody or anything, including myself. And so living out there, I was just very much confronted with the elements. I was confronted with myself in a very sobering way. I didn't have access to psychedelics out there. I was smoking pot like most of the time. And I would just kind of try to give myself space and listen to what was going on in my mind, and then watch the different narratives and not feel like I had to be tied to necessarily one. Like why should I have to hold on to this thing for so many days? Why should I feel miserable for so many fucking days in a row? It was just too much to bear. There was this moment where my brother's friend and his wife and their child, they came and visited, and we had this really beautiful nighttime picnic barbecue down on the lake. And over the course of my depression, I talked to numerous people about like my state of mind. And again, mostly feeling like I couldn't relate to anybody because I was dug in like a tick more than anybody I had met really at that moment in my life. But this guy I was talking to, he had spent a few weeks in a monastery, in a Buddhist monastery in California before they were making the trip up to Washington. And he was a writer, and he's had his struggles as being an artist as well, going through depressive spells. And he just sort of casually tossed out this phrase after I told him basically this whole story that I'm telling you. And he was like, "You know what, man? It sounds like you have Zen sickness." And I couldn't believe how that blew me away. It just was like this moment of clarity where the wind rushed up my back and I got chills and just was like in touch and in tune with everything again. It was a euphoric moment. It was really like the light had been turned on, and that God turned on the switch and there was the big bang and life could start over again and I could be a new person and pick up the pieces of who I still was. Like I'm still the same person. I still love music and I still have these fundamental pillars. I actually like sort of had these visions at times of like these things that kind of made me who I am, and I sort of contemplated and meditated on what those were, and so I sort of envisioned these pillars of like that I'm a musician, and that I love people, and that I love living on this planet, and I love experience, and I love experiencing DMT, and I love sharing everything with anyone, and having this newfound sense of transparency, and wanting to instill that, not project that onto anybody else. Because I mean, once you experience DMT, like you have to be careful of not like sort of proselytizing and like basically creating another religion. Nobody wants that. Everyone basically should have their own religion. And so I'm glad that I had found mine, and that I could just speak my truth and share my truth, and that could be that, and that could resonate with some people, and that could be something that it could be shared or not, and it didn't have to be anything serious, but I don't need to be apathetic either. I can hold the emotional weight of myself evenly. I guess to kind of bring that all back around, that's what I learned, is that that I didn't want to give up. I didn't want to go up that hill and like sort of fulfill this idea of maybe giving myself a sky burial to the vultures, that I could just keep climbing that mountain. I don't have to stop yet. I can keep climbing because everyone else is climbing, and you can look and see across the horizon that we're all like on the same plane together, but we're all moving along with one another. And that gave me a lot of comfort. That gave me the comfort that I needed, even if like friendships and family like fall away in ways that are completely unprecedented, that will shake you to your like emotional and human core. I was listening to this guy the other day talk about how he's still um this guy mentioned this notion of not so much wanting to like subscribe to the idea of spirituality, because like science and spirituality could coincide, but he sort of described it as relationality, that we all have these different relationships to concepts and people, and that there's a way that you can sort of moderate and balance that at all times, and that that's basically all that life seems to be, is trying to balance yourself at all times so you're not too far in one way or another, so you don't get stuck in extremism and end up like hurting yourself and other people.
Here's something interesting, right? You talk about the DMT trip by talking about the things that you took from it and apply to your life outside of that trip. And what I'm curious about, I want to know what those visions are, like what that DMT experience was itself that led you,
that spurred those things,
spurred those things, because those concepts that you're talking about, those were accompanied by, well, emotional, visual, and conceptual I'm going to say distortions or anomalies. I'll call them anomalies.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, that's the thing, is like they could very well just, I mean, it's hallucinations, but it's so convincing. It feels more real than reality. You really do feel like you're in touch with other entities. And because I mean, what would be the difference, really? What other opportunity would you have to interact with beings from other worlds that have similar consciousness or ability to emote ideas to other living organisms? DMT is so wildly vibrant and inspiring. And now when I have these visions, these death and birth visions and life visions on DMT, I'm not afraid of them, because they're just maybe bad dreams, but kind of fucking so what? Like, you have bad experiences, you can try to not necessarily absorb them, but embrace them. So I guess what I'm getting at was, like, there was an overall effect that DMT was like associative in like informing why I felt so alone in my depression. And the reason being is because of the visions that I had. And so I guess here's part two, right? Visions is such a cheap, like, DMT to me is pure synesthesia. When I'm there, my everything is blended beyond the senses. Kind of like the way that, like, they say there's like 6 different types of taste, in a way, like where there's like sour and salty and sweet and fat. Like there's like very distinctive palates. And basically you get a lot of these spectrums. Well, what happens when you start adding all these spectrums up and you start blending them together in one sort of conduit visual landscape? It's just weird, because like, you basically, like, how can you really equivocate? Oh man, I think that's why I got so depressed. It was because I was like, how the fuck am I going to describe this to people? Like, how when I came back the first time, it's so ineffable. It is the cathedral of reality. What's interesting to me is that there's not mosques, but maybe they are mosques in Iran, and I think in Pakistan. The architecture of these places is wildly fractalized looking and reminds me so much of DMT, that when I saw that architecture, I was like, were they informed by like psilocybin or maybe ergot or like, how did humans conceive architecture in this physical reality like hundreds of years ago? How were they able to translate that? Because when I have these visions with DMT, it's like a roller coaster. They're ever evolving. But maybe I'll just describe a couple really fun anecdotes, like kind of little moments that I've had. One of the best ones I've had was when I was in the Arboretum with my friend who had acquired DMT through the Silk Road, and he had gotten the powder, and we were smoking at the Arboretum, and I was laying down in the grass, and I was looking up at the tree, the campy tree line, and everything started folding over itself in a sort of kaleidoscopic fashion. And then in just like infinite layers, like the trees just like melted into each other in like perfect geometric shapes and just spiraled into infinity. But somehow then all of a sudden I was floating above them. I'd floated above them into this perfectly diamond blue sky. It was so blue, like it started to look like there was texture behind it, and almost kind of like the thought tank that what's his name has in X-Men. Do you know that chamber that I'm talking about?
You're talking about not Magneto, Professor Xavier's.
Yes,
I
his
don't know what
thought.
it's called.
Yeah, you know what I mean though. It's like that, but whatever that room is, like DMT also has the sensation of an infinite cavern where there's like walls to it, but they go on forever. It doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense in that world that you can describe in this reality because every rule is broken. Every rule, including the rule that you think you're supposed to be there, even a ball of consciousness. Nope, like that doesn't even happen. So, anyways, I'm floating above the trees. I'm in this diamond blue sky, and all of a sudden, these giant hexagonal structures floating in the sky, sort of separated from one another. They looked like some shit out of Stargate. I don't know else to describe it. Like there was writing on them. They were built out of some crazy metal material. Um, but in between these rings, and there was probably several, in between the rings, there were rings of beings, of entities, of organisms from other like this is like it's weird how I just knew this. I didn't have to figure this out. As soon as I saw it, I knew what was going on. I had come upon an intergalactic order, an intergalactic congress of organisms, and they were meeting about something and maybe everything. They were just discussing things. They were talking to one another, and all of a sudden, in the most fucking eerie way possible, they all fucking look at me. And I mean, I can't really recount any other times that I got goosebumps or frisson when I was on DMT, but I'll tell you what, dude, that was one of the freakiest fucking things I've ever experienced. Like, I wasn't scared, and neither were they, because we both sort of knew we couldn't, and it both kind of felt like we both knew we were experiencing a rift in time space. Honestly, like I had this weird theory that DMT actually affords an opportunity of ripping through space time, and you actually do get an opportunity of basically being in two places at once on the other side of the galaxy. Maybe it's spooky action. Maybe it's like two molecules affecting one another across space and time without having any direct influence on one another. It was so strange. I don't know how else to describe it. But they saw me, and we were speaking to one another, and they were basically like, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here yet." Or like, and I was like, "Wait, yet?" Like, but that's like that was a notion. These weren't words that were said. These were just things that were felt. I don't like this is this is why DMT and hallucinations are so difficult to describe, is because it's like it just dematerializes from once you start saying things with the limited language that we have. Our language is actually quite a hindrance in these contexts. So they're looking at me, I'm looking at them. They all of a sudden start to get what seemed like a little perturbed. They're like, "Hey, what is going on?" They started kind of moving around a little bit, and I motioned my hand out in a very calming way. Like I motioned my hand and my arm toward them with my hand open, my palm facing them, and I twisted my hand from left to right like I was turning a dial, and I thought in my head, I thought, it's okay. And I turned my hand, and all of a sudden near them, there was like this flash of light that went from black to red to yellow to white. And they were all we were all kind of surprised by this. And then all of a sudden from that, maybe there was like a wind force or something, but then we all sort of blew away from one another. We sort of dispersed and flew away. And then all of a sudden I was back in the roller coaster and just seeing wild geometric shapes. I was basically, it felt like I went into another wormhole, kind of like the way that Jodie Foster does in Contact when she's traveling, like she's stopping at like Vega and then the next place and then these other places. It very much felt like that. And so it was funny to come back from these DMT trips and be like, man, how much of these trips are just your brain recycling every fucking thing that they've ever cataloged? What deep synapses do you have? What connections do you have that are informing your DMT experiences? So I've definitely thought about that. I couldn't say one way or another that I actually believe that I've been in touch with entities, because these could all just be projections of my own psyche, right? Like or however else I would describe that. There's no way to prove any of this. Like a couple years ago, I wanted to believe these things because it felt so convincing. It was like I would be shaking when I got back. It felt like, have you seen Galaxy Quest?
I don't remember it. It had Tim Robbins. Was that not
Yes.
Tim Robbins? Was it Tim Robbins?
The
guy on
Tim Allen.
Tim Allen.
There's a moment when Tim Allen, he gets sent across like he's like in his kitchen. He's like in some normal life situation, and then all of a sudden he's like covered in this goo and he gets fucking shot across the universe. And I love because it does like this funny clip where it like travels, like the camera travels through his eyeball, through like a black hole out his eyeball, and all of a sudden he's somewhere else, like in a different universe, and he's like like just completely fucking shaken. And that's exactly how I felt when I came back. So that was like maybe the third or fourth time that I've smoked DMT, and almost every time I've met them, quote unquote them. I'm not going to call them them because I'm convinced they're us, because to me consciousness is like maybe a conduit that's shared by many other organisms, and there's like this sort of universal trust code that if anything else has a capacity for sentience, that you should give them respect, and that everything should be on the same playing field. Like honestly, eventually I hope we do stop eating animals as the human species. I don't know, just shit like octopus having neurons in their tentacles, and theories that they are entities that are like organisms that came to our Earth like a couple 100 million years ago via panspermia, like the way that a lot of people theorize that life happened on this planet, like comets bringing other bacteria and other things to this planet and then cultivating here.
What would be the thing that you took from it and would say suggest to others?
I guess to treat it like everything else in this life, to take everything with a grain of salt. Don't go too far one way or the other. I mean, that's not to say don't feel passion, and we're human and we're fallible and we have hormones and we feel the influences of our local galactic neighborhood. I mean, we feel the effects of the moon. That's a pretty wild thing that we don't think about on a daily basis. And so I would say, yeah, like, take everything with a grain of salt. Don't be so convinced that the narrative that you feel like you might be stuck in is what you're going to be stuck in forever. Let yourself change and let your ideas change, but be open.
This episode was produced by me, Philip Johnson. All music was written, produced, and generously donated by VoxMod. You can find his music at voxmod.com. A list of all songs used can be found in the description section of this episode. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe. Also, leave a review. I'd really appreciate it. Lastly, if you have a story and you'd like to share it, I'd love to hear it. Shoot me an email at psychotropicpodcast@hotmail.com. Thanks again, everybody. See you next time.
Oh wait, actually, can I tell you one quick little anecdote that was super fascinating? So that same trip, actually, the third or fourth one, when I was coming back, to me, like some of the most beautiful moments about DMT is when you're between worlds. So when I was coming to, and I started to get up off the ground, it was as if I had literally been living on the ground for millions of years, because my hair and my body had become a nursery log and vines and earth and like roots. Like my hair was roots. And when I looked down at my body, it was like a hollowed out nursery log, but it still had organic matter in it, like my organs. And so as soon as I looked at my organs, they liquefied into like green mossy matter and just trickled down my legs, like through the hollows of my legs. And it wasn't frightening. I was actually amazed and kind of laughing and kind of like, oh my God, this is my body. Whoa. And you feel it too. So I don't know. It's strange. It's like a beautiful dream. It's a wild, beautiful dream.